Hello, my name is Augustus Huang. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the US and its foreign policy objectives of the 21st century. Many people argue and complain that the US has done more harm than good in pursuing these objectives within the past decade, but allow me to delve into the wide scope of specifics before you may discredit the progress that the US has made on international scales. First contention, human rights. For people living in the US, it's hard to imagine a typical day in which the government violates our rights to life, liberty, and happiness, if you will. We can walk the streets without fear and we are free to voice our opinions. However, it's a wonderful privilege that we sometimes take for granted. In other countries, there are people who are subjected to massive human rights violations, and the United States had taken notice. Here we will look at Syria, the relatively small country that currently exists between Turkey and Iraq. Recently, the country has been dealing with controversies and disagreements in respect to the government, which is led by a dictator. Merely protesting for political reform, the people of Syria became oppressed and harmed by their own government as massive violence and wrongdoing broke out. Amnesty USA reported in 2011, security forces used grossly excessive force against people. More than 10,000 people reportedly died during or in connection with the protests. Most of those killed were shot by members of the security forces. Tanks were used in military operations in civilian residential areas. Some members of the security forces who joined in opposition to the government were also killed. Unfortunately, this is only the tip of the iceberg, and only one example of the atrocities which occurred in Syria. There, the government also denied freedom of religion, upon penalty of death or imprisonment. Or there were also the 1.7 million Kurds who constituted more than 10% of the population, but were all denied citizenship because of their faith. It was also illegal to be homosexual. People were killed for that too. Heard enough? I'll keep going. In Syria, people were strictly denied even the freedom of movement. If you were in there, you were stuck there unless granted access to leave by the authorities. Not that it ever really happened. It has also been widely reported that Syrian security officers freely raped young children and women day in and day out. Torture, mass murder, and forced disappearances were as real as they could get. So in all seriousness, the sorts of acts which existed within Syria are unacceptable in any situation, and such facts are difficult to swallow. So even though the civilians of Syria are not my own countrymen, I'll be glad to discuss the efforts that the US has provided in alleviation of these heavy infringements of rights. Within the past year, the Obama administration has made possible several steps for improvement. First, the US has gotten Syria involved and acquainted with the International Criminal Court, which has already prevented a greater spread of the punitive treatment of Syrians. While Syria is not currently engaged in ink with the ICC, it has been made clear that the continuation of such violations will lead to grave consequences. Walkes-Jarrow reports in September of 2013, referring Syria to the ICC was a crucial step toward accountability for the crimes by all sides, whether by government forces, opposition fighters, jihadists, or other militias. It sets a valuable reference point for other judicial initiatives, including national trials and even potentially some kind of mixed judicial entity, which US officials have indicated they are working toward establishing. US administration has also successfully prevented the proliferation and outbreak of chemical weaponry within Syria. Earlier this year, Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad agreed to get rid of the country's chemical weaponry after months of negotiation. This was crucial because the development of chemical warfare would have inevitably led to horrific outcomes around the globe. These substances would have been capable of killing a group of 1,000 people with a single spray of gas. Fortunately, a large portion of this issue has been substantially resolved by the US and its UN backings. But as we can see, Syria itself is quite a long story. It is in itself a sensitive time bomb with thorns on every corner. So while one might complain because the situations in Syria are far from solved and are definitely not perfect, it would be unfair to say that the US has done more harm than good. Given its cards, the US has done a substantial amount of good without actually exacerbating the circumstances. The world, including Syria itself, is now more conscientious of its abuses, and overall progress is there. And also now the Kurds I mentioned earlier have been granted citizenship, so I think they're getting along better than before. Second contention, nuclear and general sanctioning in countries such as North Korea and Iran. Since the turn of the century, North Korea has consistently placed itself within the category of being an axis of evil. Attributes of this epithet are due in part to an oppressive dictatorship and also abuse in weaponry. Let's start with nuclear weapons. Everyone knows about nukes. North Korea within the past decade has continued its underground construction and development of a nuclear arsenal which could, needless to say, be extremely dangerous. Even worse yet, Pyongyang had announced preemptive threats to nuke both the US and South Korea, often the main reason just because. However, in March 2013, the US, in collaboration with the UN, managed to impose effective sanctions on the authoritarian state, creating disincentive to and making less feasible the acts of treachery incessantly voiced by North Korea. These sanctions have included embargoes on arms, ban of certain technological imports, and the freezing of funds and economic resources. These provisional sanctions have been a key step in the regulation of the potential violence and dangers which Communist North Korea has appointed. The Global Policy Forum writes, a month after the Council adopted the US-backed sanctions, North Korea agreed to return to the six-party talks, including China, Japan, and South Korea. The talks, which began when North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003, are a negotiation on Pyongyang's nuclear program. So, the way Kim Jong-un treats his own people is already a recognized problem. The last thing we wanted was him spraying around nukes like soap bubbles. Furthermore, as I've mentioned earlier, Iran is also a nation which has posed international threats with misconduct of nuclear weaponry. Empirically shown to have possessed large amounts of terrorist organizations, Iran, with nuclear weaponry, would have provided huge hazards to not only the US, but also nations allied with the US, such as Israel. Fortunately, the US along with other nations recognize the importance to keep the instabilities of Iran in check with logical sanctioning. So what did we do? We focused on oil, gas, and petrochemicals, and in doing so, this affected Iran's economy in such a way that the governmental policies did not reach menacing conclusions. So while the US hasn't exactly been the most lenient playmate in the global sandbox, the ends have been great. In its foreign policy objectives, the US has been able to strive towards ultimatums of peace and regulations with countries that have displayed rough boisterousness within the past decade, making the world a safer place for everyone. Third contention, terrorism and Al-Qaeda. This is a topic that possesses a trove of discussion and numerous amounts of possible starting points, but for the sake of efficiency, I'll start with the pursuit of the former leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. Established as a huge threat to the US, bin Laden was a terrorist whose actions and plans were unacceptable and unforgivable. In its war against terror, the US military spent years tracking down the killer, eventually finding bin Laden in Pakistan in 2011. Where he was then executed. Unfortunately, damage had already been done by then, comprising of over a dozen lethal bombings across the globe, and of course the unforgettable tragedy at the World Trade Center in 2001. But, since bin Laden's termination, Al-Qaeda has become substantially less of a threat, and the group has indeed lost most of its power. USA Today wrote in 2012, the Pakistan-based group is scrambling to survive under fire from CIA drone strikes and lying low due to the fear of another US raid. U.S. counter-terrorist action has reduced the chances of a sophisticated, multi-pronged attack on the U.S. like the attacks of September 11th or the deadly bombings in Madrid in 2004 and in London in 2005. An attack with weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, or nuclear by any Al-Qaeda-related terror group is now unlikely. Overall, it's a pretty big deal. In its endeavors, the U.S. has been able to decimate Al-Qaeda and bring more worldly order and peace. The war on terror has had monumental progress, and I would hardly call that more harm than good. So when we all really take a step back to look upon this century, it's easy to recognize that there have been many conflicts and issues flooding countries everywhere, and in many cases these problems couldn't be ignored. So the US took moral initiative in its foreign policy objectives and allowed for substantial progress in the quest for order and peace. Through the course of these past years, based on what the US has done, the goods surely outweigh the bad. Sure, it often seems easy to see and complain about what isn't perfect in the world, but when we take a moment to reflect on the imperfections that the US has potentially prevented, it can be seen that much betterment has been achieved, and for that I am grateful. USA all the way. Thank you.